All right. Well, hi, everyone. Welcome to today's Red Hill Rediscovered program. I appreciate you all joining us across all our platforms. If this is your first time here, my name is Cody Youngblood, and I'm the Director of Historic Preservation and Collections here at Patrick Henry's Red Hill. And this is a really special program today because we're celebrating Black History Month with one of the most important people here at Red Hill, an enslaved woman named Critty. Now, as we go throughout the presentation, please feel free to leave any comments or questions in the comment section or the chat box, and they'll be answered at the end when we have our Q&A session. So to get us off started here, again, in honor of Black History Month, we wanted to highlight Critty, who we believe to have been the Henry family's enslaved cook. In the 18th century Virginia, enslaved cooks and chefs played a crucial role in the functioning of large estates and households where their culinary skills were central to daily life and hospitality. While Critty is not a household name like her enslaver Patrick Henry, she represents the often overlooked yet important labor of enslaved cooks. And she was responsible for preparing meals for the Henry family and their guests when large plantations required elaborate feasts and daily meals for many people. Cooking, which of course required skill, knowledge of ingredients, and an understanding of how to prepare large quantities of food, was a significant aspect of maintaining the estate. Although Critty's individual story may not be fully detailed, enslaved cooks like her were essential to maintaining the social and economic order on Virginia plantations. They often worked in kitchens separate from the main house, managing their own space while ensuring they satisfied the families that enslaved them. Despite the hardships of their lives, however, these cooks often preserved and invented American culinary traditions while preserving African culinary traditions as well. And this influenced regional cooking practices for generations. Now, to give you some context, Red Hill is located in Charlotte County, Virginia, on the Stanton River. In his retirement, Patrick Henry purchased Red Hill in March 1794 with about 700 acres and moved his family into the small house, which, along with several outbuildings, were constructed about 20 years prior. Upon Patrick Henry's death in June 1799, his estate, including 67 enslaved individuals, was given to his wife, Dorothea Dandridge. And we can see her right here. About 11 years later, Dorothea gave the property to her two youngest sons, John and Edward Winston. Edward would ultimately separate his portion of Red Hill for his own use, but John remained in his father's original home and enslaved more than 50 people at the end of the Civil War in 1865. And Critty existed through this all. And I'd like to read you a bit of a biography on Critty so you can get to know her a bit better. And this was actually researched and written by our historian and genealogist of African American history, Peyton Young. And they're truly the real historian when it comes to Red Hill's genealogical information, especially when researching and understanding the descendants of enslaved people here. So Critty was born in Halifax County, enslaved, south of Charlotte County, around 1755. And you can see the county delineated here by that red dot on the map. She was of Afro-Indigenous descent, a fact confirmed in her death registration in 1860, where her enslaver John Henry had the phrase half Indian written by her name. Now, while John did not know who Critty's parents were, he felt it necessary to ensure that her Afro-Indigeneity be recorded, an act that foreshadowed how she would be remembered for generations thereafter. Unfortunately, virtually nothing is known about Critty's early life, but local legend recalls that Critty was either married to an indigenous man referred to by the locals as Indian Jim, or Indian Jim fathered her with an unknown enslaved woman who he married. It's unclear exactly how Critty came to have Afro-Indigenous ancestry, but it's important to note that the Saponi were the dominant native community inhabiting Southside Virginia through the end of the 18th century. And as European Americans continued to settle further southwest into the Piedmont region, bringing enslaved Africans with them, this would have created more opportunities for Native and Black people to interact. And Critty's racial background was likely forged through these interactions. And between 1791 and 1799, Critty had three sons named Coleman, Jack White, and Harrison. Their father is never identified in any of Henry's records, which could mean that their father or grandfather was a free native man or a man at least with native ancestry. Both Jack White and Harrison were recalled as being of native ancestry, with Harrison retaining some physical characteristics that denoted his mixed heritage. Now, Critty and her children first appear in Red Hill's records in Patrick Henry's 1799 estate inventory, taken a month after his death. They all appear in Red Hill's second estate inventory, which was taken on September 11th, 1802. In it, all Critty's children were recorded as being under the age of 12. And the broad date range within which Critty's children were born shows that she was likely able to start building a family before being moved to Red Hill from another property. There's a viable possibility that I'll explain to you here in a moment how that may have occurred. In 1797, just a few years after Patrick Henry purchased Red Hill from Richard Booker, Henry prepared to finalize his purchase of the Seven Islands plantation in Halifax County from Richard's brother, William Marshall Booker. At that time, Seven Islands already had several enslaved people residing on it, whom Henry would ultimately purchase along with the plantation. In a letter to William from March 20th, 1797, Henry explained his reasoning for purchasing the enslaved people along with the land, stating that, quote, "I will also hire the Negroes as they are desirous to stay together and be not parted, and I will use them well." Now, considering Critty was born in Halifax County and did not appear in Red Hill's records until the late 1790s, it's reasonable to suggest that William Booker may have enslaved her and whatever children she had before 1797 on Seven Islands. Then Patrick Henry bought her and her children when he purchased that land. At some point, they were brought to Red Hill, where Critty and her family appear to have remained intact until Patrick Henry's death. And when Henry died on June 6, 1799, Critty and her sons were amongst dozens of enslaved people left at the mercy of his widow, Dorothea Henry, and her efforts to distribute his estate amongst his heirs. In his last will and testament, Henry gave Dorothea total ownership of his lands, 20 enslaved people of her choosing from his estate, and the power to distribute the remaining 47, and by 1802, 49 enslaved people amongst their children and grandchildren. Critty and her sons likely only lived together at Red Hill from around 1797 at the earliest to 1802, when Dorothea Henry married Judge Edmund Winston, her late husband's cousin and an executor to his will. That same year, Dorothea and Judge Winston moved to his plantation called Hunting Tower in Buckingham County, Virginia, where she took those 20 enslaved people from Henry's estate, including Critty and her children. By late 1802, Critty was either severely ill or had suffered some ailment or injury that impacted her ability to work. Henry's estate inventory for that year recorded the then 47-year-old as being, quote, very infirm. And what was no doubt one of the most vulnerable points of her life, Critty would be forced to move away from Red Hill and very soon after was separated from her sons. Between 1802 and 1818, Dorothea Henry Winston likely enslaved Critty at Buckingham County and possibly Lynchburg, where Judge Winston died in 1818. From 1802 to 1807, Harrison, Jack White, and Coleman likely spent their childhoods enslaved at Hunting Tower with their mother. And between 1807 and 1815, Dorothea's youngest sons started to marry and assume properties of their own in different parts of central and south side Virginia. And this likely prompted her to begin distributing Critty's children to her sons' growing households. Following Judge Edmund Winston's death in 1818, Dorothea moved herself and the people she enslaved to her daughter Sarah Butler Henry's home at Seven Islands. Dorothea Winston remained there for the rest of her life, and Critty likely remained enslaved there for at least some of Dorothea's later years, and possibly until Dorothea died in 1831. In her will, she bequeathed Critty to her grandson, William Robertson Henry, who was then 10 years old and a son of Nathaniel West Henry, living in Rockingham County, North Carolina. Now, while she may have spent some time in Rockingham, Critty eventually found her way back to Red Hill for reasons unknown and seems to have remained there for the rest of her life. She's generally understood to have been Red Hill's cook during this period. And as cooking was one of the most strenuous domestic labors an enslaved person could perform, it can be assumed that she had recovered enough from her 1802 ailment or injury to resume arduous work. Critty and her son Harrison appear to have been the only members of their family enslaved by John Henry at Red Hill by the mid 19th century. Critty is generally interpreted as the enslaved cook, while Harrison was an enslaved coachman. In 1860, Critty unfortunately died around the age of 105, according to Charlotte County's death register. And she was likely buried at Red Hill in Quarter Place Cemetery, where she remains along with her son Harrison. Quarter Place is a half-mile long trail that today represents the hub of enslaved African American life at Red Hill. The cemetery at the end of this trail holds the remains of 147 people, and since its beginnings in the 1790s, it is one of the oldest historically Black cemeteries in Virginia. So again, thank you, Peyton, for that great biography on Critty. And Peyton is also the one who does significant research into identifying the names of the 147 individuals here at Quarter Place. To date, we've been able to identify 53 of those 147 names. So now that we've introduced Critty, let's talk about her kitchen. Like virtually all the buildings at Red Hill, the kitchen is a somewhat elusive building, and its history is not well known. The earliest known image of a kitchen at Red Hill is this watercolor you see on your screen, painted in 1904 by Susan Ulrich Lowe. She was a cousin of the Henry family. It's a simple one-room, 1.5-story building with a stone chimney at its north end, which is the right side. You'll also notice several large iron cauldrons and 2 young Black children by the front door. This is likely the kitchen that Patrick Henry's son John used during his residency in the 19th century. And it may even date back to his father, Patrick Henry's residency in the 1790s, but archaeological research is still needed to date this structure conclusively. And it is definitely on the list to excavate this structure. We know the location of it, so we'll get there soon. And by 1912, Lucy Gray Henry Harrison, Patrick Henry's great-granddaughter, expanded the Henry family home into a large mansion. As part of those expansions, a kitchen was added to the mansion's west wing, rendering the detached kitchen redundant. As you can see in this image, the original kitchen had a small addition built on its south wall, and it was turned into a servant's quarters. Several of those servants are pictured here in front of the quarters around 1918. By this time, wisteria, as you can see, had grown up around the front porch, but you can still get a good look at the original stone chimney at the top right. The identities of those pictured have not yet been confirmed, but a news article from 1918 suggests one of these women may be named Becky, and some of the youngsters may be her children. Unfortunately, this building burned on Christmas Day in 1928, so it no longer stands. By 1955, Red Hill had been purchased by the Patrick Henry Memorial Foundation, which undertook a restoration of the property with the goal to bring it back to the 18th century. Lynchburg-based architect Stanhope Johnson had been a draftsman in the early 1900s when his boss was contracted to expand Lucy Harrison's mansion. And he was chosen to lead restoration efforts by the foundation, and by 1957 had completed the reconstruction of the Henry family home and kitchen. According to Johnson, he remembered what he thought to be the original kitchen standing east of the house. The building was, according to him, again, being used as a storage house by the early 1900s, and a shed roof had replaced its original gable roof. Lucy Harrison ordered this building's demolition to allow for the mansion's expansion, but before it was raised, Johnson said he had taken measured drawings of the kitchen and its unique chimney and fireplace. He said he used these drawings when reconstructing the building about 45 years later. We can see a result of those drawings on the right. This is the reconstructed kitchen seen after its completion in 1957. And this is the building that still stands here today. Now, unfortunately, it's important to note that some doubt overshadows Johnson's claim that the kitchen stood east of the house. As seen in this image before Lucy Harrison's expansion around 1906, no building, is seen to the east. That's to the right side of the house. Stanhope Johnson claimed to have found parts of the kitchen's foundations when he investigated the property in the 1950s, but no documentation was made of those discoveries, so it's unclear exactly what building he found. We'll now go back and put into context Critty's life and her surroundings. So, in Virginia, during Critty's lifetime, it was a pretty diverse place. In 1790, there were 292,627 enslaved blacks in Virginia, or about 39% of the total population. By 1820, the enslaved population had almost doubled, with 206,879 enslaved women and 218,274 enslaved men. 80% of the enslaved population lived on rural plantations like Red Hill. And by the start of the Civil War, just 1 year after Critty's death, 1,355 Virginia plantations had between 40 to 100 enslaved people working and living on them. Red Hill was, of course, one of these plantations. And in 1860, the Charlotte County slave census recorded 48 enslaved persons at Red Hill. And this they ranged from ages 2 to 70. So quite a significant range here. Now, these 48 people were recorded as living among 12 slave quarters, but in Critty's case, she likely lived in the kitchen itself. For historical accuracy's sake, we'll focus on the original kitchen at Red Hill, which certainly, again, existed in the 19th century. This building was fairly typical of detached kitchens in Virginia. Although kitchens were often located in the basement or common rooms of 17th century homes in America, they soon became separate buildings by the early 18th century. And kitchens were, in fact, the most common outbuilding listed in the 18th century Virginia Gazette newspaper. Hugh Jones, a mathematics teacher from the College of William and Mary, noted in his survey of the Virginia colony in 1724 that planters often kept their, quote, kitchen apart from the dwelling house because of the smell of victuals, offensive in hot weather. Kitchens were not only separated from the main house due to heat, smells, and a risk of fire, but a critical ideological shift in how Virginia viewed race transformed the plantation architecture. After Bacon's Rebellion in 1676, when poor whites and enslaved Africans attempted to overthrow the local government, elite planters began to reevaluate this social stratum. By the late 17th century, this resulted in planters building small homes and outbuildings for enslaved people, furthering the divide between the two groups. Architectural historian Dale Upton says, quote, elite whites carefully orchestrated exercise in the definitions of space, delineating two spaces, white and black or poor white. John Michael Vlack agrees, saying, quote, separating the kitchen from the main plantation house was one of several related architectural gestures that signaled the onset of a more rigid form of chattel slavery that would persist until the middle of the 19th century. And the popular Georgian and federal architectural styles also reflected this cultural change by building homes and spaces using public and private rooms according to symmetry and social function. We can see that here in the high-style Georgian home Gunston Hall in Northern Virginia. You can see several small outbuildings just to the back of it on the right and left side. Although Red Hill is more vernacular or simpler in its construction, the external kitchen was no doubt a way to provide a space to delineate race and class. When looking at the form and function of Red Hill's kitchen, we can see a small building with one room on the first floor and a loft above in the half story. Most external kitchens resemble the main house in both style and material, as is the case here, because we can certainly see that when we compare the kitchen to this artist interpretation of Patrick Henry's home in the 1790s. Both are wood framed, whitewashed, with a gable end chimney. On the kitchen, this stone chimney leads inside to a large hearth. The singular door is, of course, characteristic of its time. Many kitchens only had one door that usually faced the main house. Not only did this provide closer access when delivering food, but it reminded the cook and her staff of their mistress's constant surveillance. Inside, the kitchen may have looked something like this. A single cook room would take up the entire first floor. A simple wood ladder would provide access to the above loft space where Critty and her children lived. The walls of the cookroom would have been plastered and whitewashed to ensure cleanliness and easy cleaning when a mess did happen. The floor was likely brick, as seen in the kitchen here at Gunston Hall, or a dirt. Pots, skillets, Dutch ovens, and food storage jars were stored on tables and fixed shelving, while a central table would suffer the brunt of the food prep work. Iron forks, spoons, and pot hooks hung nearby, and with this in mind, it's obvious that kitchens had all available amenities. But given Critty's enslaved status, her access to such amenities was limited. Moving upstairs, a loft space like the one you see here is where Critty and her children would have lived. The watercolor of Red Hill's kitchen shows evidence of a window in this space, which would have provided much needed light and fresh air above the hot kitchen. Now, we don't know what this room would have looked like at Red Hill, but Critty's family's beds may have been a basic straw mat with a wool blanket or even a framed flax mattress. This was one of the few places that provided privacy to Critty. Whereas the field hands shared small rooms with numerous people in arrangements that often ignored familial bonds, the kitchen loft was Critty's own. Although this could be viewed as somewhat ideal, the field hands did not have to sleep next to a roaring fire or use a hearth regardless of the weather. And some respite may have been found by sleeping outside during the summer, but this still did not protect from mosquitoes. Living with her children in the kitchen did provide Critty with a more intimate family setting. Jack White and Coleman possibly helped their mother with tedious tasks such as picking stems, shucking corn, and making biscuits. And according to tradition, young Harrison worked in the main house as a servant, which was another common role for children of cooks. The practice of having Critty's children work and live with her, of course, carried into the profits of slavery that the Henrys would have enjoyed. Many newspaper advertisements of the day show that enslaved cooks were often sold with their children to preserve domestic stability. We can also see evidence of this in Critty's life, as she was likely purchased by Henry with her children from William Booker. And we know what Critty would have seen and used in her day-to-day work thanks to three estate inventories taken of Red Hill. One in 1799 and 1802 after Patrick Henry's death, and a third in 1868 after his son John's death. You can see some of the items listed on the 1799 inventory here. Most kitchen implements are made of iron, which would have been made and repaired by the plantation blacksmith. At Red Hill, we believe the blacksmith to have been named Jesse. And this is the same inventory that Patrick Henry's 67 enslaved people were also listed on, including Critty and her three children, all valued together at 150 pounds. The 1868 kitchen inventory provides slightly less detailed information, but unlike the 1799 inventory, food was included here, including 1.5 bushels of Irish potatoes and 35 gallons of good vinegar. Much of the food, especially butter, sugar, liquor, and valuable ingredients like spices, were kept locked up in the main house, with the key usually held by the mistress. This was known as carrying the keys. And the feeling at this time was that enslaved cooks and field hands would steal these expensive items for their own consumption, and this took away from the mistress's feeling of control. Dorothea Henry likely practiced carrying the keys. There's even a tradition that says Critty's son Harrison held Dorothea's keys as a young child. And you can see on your screen here 2 18th century chatelaines. These are items that would be hooked on to a belt of some kind on a woman's waist, and those little hooks dangling on either side of the centerpiece would be used to hold things like keys or magnifying glasses, watches, things like that. So Dorothea, of course, may have had something like this, albeit a little bit simpler in style. Now, it was, after all, Dorothea as the mistress who was in charge of her family and the domestic sphere, including the enslaved house servants. Scholar Linda Paris writes of the disagreements that may have come out of this with the mistress and her family. She says, quote, "The tranquility of family, white and black, depended on her ability, the mistress's ability, to settle petty disagreements, cajole, motivate, or even threaten her servants into working, and all the while maintain an appearance of fragility and ease to her white socialites. The failure to be a good mistress, a job involving the duties of both mother and a wife, was a serious breach of responsibilities. When it came to cooking in this space, Critty worked to satisfy her mistress's wishes for a socially appropriate and delicious meal while demonstrating her own culinary talents and tastes. Entertaining guests with formal dinners allowed white planters to create a social network at their home despite their physically remote locations. The mistress played the self proclaimed central role in providing famous Virginia hospitality, but this could not have been accomplished without the forced labor of an enslaved cook. One event that would have called for a large culinary fair was the wedding of Patrick Henry's daughter, Dorothea Spotswood, to George Dabney Winston at Red Hill on June 18, 1795. This wedding would have acted as a theater production where the mistress, Dorothea Henry, would be center stage to entertain guests. Critty would be behind the scenes, ensuring Dorothea's social standing was not affected by poor cooking performance. And this relationship was built on status roles, negotiation, and yes, the constant threat of violence. On a more routine day, however, the mistress usually awoke around 5 or 6 a.m. to inspect the kitchen. This means that at Red Hill, Critty was already hard at work on the day's menu. Dorothea would check in with Critty, ensure the kitchen was clean, and ration the day's spices before turning to other duties, including tutoring her children. Critty prepared an average of 4 meals a day: breakfast, dinner, tea, and supper. Breakfast was set out at daybreak and was available until mid morning because of the different schedules that many folks had on the plantation. Critty likely prepared biscuits, breads, meats, porridge, preserves, coffee, and tea. And dinner would be eaten around 2 or 3 p.m. They didn't really have the concept of lunch at this time, so dinner would be the day's largest meal. Preparation for this took up most of the morning hours. And because Red Hill is located on a large river in a wooded area, fresh fish and game were likely served at almost every meal. Most fruits, vegetables, and meats, including beef, pork, and chicken, served at the table at Red Hill, were raised on the plantation or purchased from Cole's Ferry store or on the market at Charlotte Courthouse. Every plantation served bread, which would have been an easy make, but obviously you could not make that when preparing meals. So Critty had to use her high intelligence in this complex multitasking feat. Patrick Henry was fond of Virginia cooking and notably spoke against Thomas Jefferson upon learning that he gave up the local cuisine for French food. This meant that Critty not only worked within the confines of recipes dictated by Dorothea Henry, but it also allowed her to infuse her culture's traditions through food. Critty's own Afro-indigeneity meant she could combine both her African and American indigenous roots through ingredients such as okra, corn cakes, grits, beans, squash, and hominy. Patrick Henry may have enjoyed meals such as gumbo and jambalaya at Red Hill without even knowing their connection to Critty's ancestors. But through these foods, she orchestrated a subversion and resistance to the cultural oppressive nature of enslavement. And just to end us off here in conclusion, it's important to remember that Critty and her kitchen are indeed powerful reminders of the vital yet often overlooked contributions of enslaved individuals like her, who were the backbone of plantations. As the cook at Red Hill, Critty not only nourished the Henry family, but also helped preserve African and indigenous culinary traditions through her work. Her life reflects the resilience and complexity of enslaved cooks, showing how they navigated difficult circumstances while leaving an enduring impact on American cuisine. And as we reflect on Critty's legacy this Black History Month, we're reminded of the importance of recognizing the unsung voices whose stories shape our shared history and whose achievements fed a nation. I'd like to thank you again for attending this presentation. And please, if anyone has any questions, comments, leave them in the comment section and they'll be answered here. But while you're thinking of any questions, I want to remind you of another presentation that's similar in subject here. This is in August 8th. I hope you'll join us again for Red Hill Rediscovered with Dr. Kelly Fanto Dietz. Dr. Dietz will discuss her book, Bound to the Fire: How Virginia's Enslaved Cooks Helped Invent American Cuisine. And I did use this book a lot in my research for today's presentation. So I do highly recommend that you join us again in August. I think it'll be a wonderful time. So again, we'll just leave it open for any last minute questions. And if there's none, we can end it here. All right, we've got a good question from Lucia here. Let's bring her up on screen. There we go. So Lucia asked on Facebook, why is Critty believed to have been the cook at Red Hill? Well, there's a couple different reasons for this. One is her age. She fits the appropriate age of a cook who would have been involved in the arduous work here at Red Hill. Another piece of evidence is we presented earlier with being purchased from the estate of William Booker because she was purchased with her children. It may have been likely that she had that cook's position, and in order to preserve that domestic tranquility, as it said, Henry wanted to keep that family together. We, of course, do not know if Critty was the cook here at Red Hill. We don't know the positions for sure of any enslaved person here during the 1790s. I mentioned before that Jesse may have been the enslaved blacksmith here. He may have also been a cooper or a carpenter. And again, that is based on his monetary value in the 1799 inventory. He is valued the highest among all of the enslaved individuals. I believe it's 200 pounds. So we know he's a very highly skilled position in that sense. So good question, Lucia. And another one here from Paul. How did a cook learn her trade? Who would they train to pass on the skills? So there's a couple different ways that this may have happened. When we're looking back to the 18th or 19th century, a cook may have learned as a child. She may have worked as a scullery maid, handling the more tedious tasks, getting up before the cook herself to start the fire. And she would have been personally trained by her enslaved chef. Of course, both of them would have been enslaved themselves. And then once that scullery maid was of proper age, of proper knowledge, according to her white enslavers, or she was sold off, she may have then become the cook herself. And again, she would be in a similar situation where she would then be training a younger scullery maid or assistant cook by her side. So thank you for your question, Paul. And a good one from Peyton here. Considering that Critty was likely the cook, how likely was it that her sons also performed domestic labor? It is very likely. We do know that a lot of children of enslaved cooks did perform domestic labor. As I mentioned in the presentation, we believe that maybe Jack White and Coleman, two of her sons, could have been in the kitchen helping her with the more tedious task, shucking corn, maybe getting hot water, starting the fire, things like that. And we know based on a couple written traditions that Harrison may have been an enslaved domestic servant as a young child, and then he was trained as a coachman later in life. So he would have been in charge of chauffeuring the Henry family, handling the driving horses, caring for the wagons, things like that. Of course, it's also possible that the children engaged in domestic enslavement as well, that being serving some of the food that came out of the kitchen or tending to the family's needs within the main house. We're hoping to find more evidence of these possible positions in the future, but that's what we know so far. So thank you for your question, Peyton. All right. Well, that looks like that's all the questions we have for today. Thank you again to everyone who attended. If your friends missed this presentation, this will be posted on all of our platforms, Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn, Instagram, and they'll be able to watch it later. So thank you again for attending. Happy Valentine's Day to everyone, and we'll see you all next month. Bye-bye.